And today we're going to talk a little bit about estimating how much you need for retirement. So I will, of course, get started since we're already late. But first, anything you hear today is general advice. I obviously don't know anything about you, so I can't offer personal advice. But questions obviously are great. So send through any questions that you may have. And obviously, sorry about the technical difficulties. Okay, so let's get started. So we're going to talk about how to estimate how much you need for retirement, which is, of course, an important thing to do, especially if you are about to retire, but also a really good thing to do if you are younger and you still have a long time before retirement. And the reason for this, of course, even though it may be early and there may be still a fair amount of time to go, it's important just so you can figure out where you are and where you're tracking. And remember, anytime you estimate something and there is a long time before it actually is going to happen, that estimate will likely change, but still makes sense to establish that baseline that you can then pivot off of afterwards. So we're going to talk, well, this is the agenda. You can see what we're going to go into. We'll talk a little bit about goals. I'll do that very quickly and why goals are important. And then we'll get into how to figure out how to estimate how much you may need for retirement, which tells us all sorts of good things like how big your portfolio needs to be. All right, so goals, and I'll do this quickly. Anytime we're trying to achieve something in investing, it's important to understand what we want to achieve. Many people kind of step back and say, okay, well, my goal is to have the most amount of money possible. And while I certainly understand that, and that probably ultimately is everyone's goal, that doesn't really give you any information about what you should do. And a lot of people kind of taking this wealth maximization approach, what they end up doing is they end up doing very dumb things with their investments, because to have the most money possible means you should always be in the best investment. And that causes overtrading, it causes chasing performance, all bad things that ultimately are not going to allow you to achieve that goal of having the most money possible or any other goal that you have. So there's a number of things that we want to estimate with every single goal, and you can see the 4 of them listed here. But the big one, of course, is how much it will cost. And that's generally the challenging one with retirement. And you can see over in this little red box, or big red box in the corner of the slides, we need to translate a lump sum into something that's acceptable from an annual income rate. So that's, of course, how much you're withdrawing from your portfolio and being able to support the lifestyle that you want to live in retirement. The other, of course, tricky thing about this is that your portfolio needs to last until your retirement ends, which, of course, is your death, and nobody knows that. So it becomes very challenging to design a portfolio that's supposed to last for an indeterminable amount of time. So those are some of the challenges we are going to go through today. All right, so we're going to do 2 different things. And the first thing we're going to do is we are going to look at what we call the income replacement rate. So very simply, we live our lives, we get paid, and all of our budgeting and spending and everything else basically comes off of a salary, an annual amount. And so people think that way. So it's really a better way to start your retirement estimation to start in that same mindset. What is that quote unquote annual salary? And since we all have different annual salaries while we're working, we tend to design our life around those. So it's a good place to start with your current salary. And then, of course, we can make adjustments depending upon how long we have until retirement, and think about how much we need to replace of that when we get into retirement. And yeah, some interesting chat. So Paul says that he uses the ASFA estimate to figure out what a basic and comfortable retirement is. So that, of course, is because of many of the challenges that people have. There are these retirement estimators, and this ASFA survey is really looking at the country as a whole and what they believe a comfortable retirement is. And while that is a good place to start, it's also important to think about what kind of lifestyle we want to live in retirement. And there are, of course, differences between how everyone pictures their retirement and how they and how they want to live their life. So first thing we're going to do, we're going to look at that income replacement rate. Then we're going to talk a little bit about safe withdrawal rates, which I know I do talk about, and talk about a lot. And combining those two things, we can figure out the lump sum that is needed for retirement. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about the income replacement rate. And really what we're talking about in terms of an income replacement rate is, as I mentioned before, thinking about the income that you currently live on and how much of that is required to support your retirement. And there are pretty significant differences. So very simply, just the math behind it is, let's say we're on a salary of $100,000 a year. We think we need $75,000 a year to support ourselves in retirement. Well, that's simply a 75% income replacement rate. And there are three main things that we generally need to adjust for as we move from our working life into our retirement life. The first one is savings. So, of course, once you move into retirement, the advantage is you don't have to save anymore. So, of course, since you're not getting paid by someone else, your savings rate generally goes to zero. The next thing you need to look at is taxes, because depending upon your tax situation, for most Australians, taxes are very different in retirement. So, of course, if you go into the pension phase of your super, you could pay no money in taxes. So we, of course, want to take taxes out of that and the taxes that we pay on our salaries. And then the last thing, of course, is we want to make adjustments for lifestyle differences, because, of course, we tend to live different lives in retirement. And that's not necessarily a savings. That can also be an addition to what we spend, but we do want to take those factors into account. All right, so very simply, I've used this website called paycalculator.com. So paycalculator.com basically means you can put in an annual salary, and what it will do is it will take a look at how much you are saving in terms of compulsory super contributions and how much you're taxable, or how much taxes are taken out of your paycheck. So it could be a really good place to start. So I just put in, very simply, $100,000 again, and we can see automatically if we start removing the amount that we pay in taxes, just our marginal tax rate on our salary, and we remove this compulsory superannuation figures, we already are getting to a 70% replacement rate. So the good news is, of course, you don't have to replace your entire salary. So that's a good starting point. So you can use that. You can use any of these other kind of paycheck estimations, or simply look at a pay stub that you get from your employer. Figure out how much is going into super, how much you're actually paying in taxes. All right. Now we need to adjust our current pay to look at what we may need in the future. So as we're all very aware of right now, we have inflation. So inflation, of course, over time will erode the purchasing power of your dollars. So especially if we have a while to go until retirement, we do want to take inflation into account. The other thing we need to take into account, of course, is lifestyle changes over the course of our working years. So maybe if you're very close to retirement, this isn't necessarily a problem. But if you do have a ways to go to retirement, you have to sit there and assume that hopefully your salary will continue to increase until you get into retirement. So really what we want to look at is two different things: the impact of inflation and salary growth in terms of lifestyle creep that will occur on our current wages. So I just used a very simple example. This is a tool on Morningstar Investor, but you can also use any sort of financial calculator or a spreadsheet or anything else that you want to do to make these changes. So all you're really looking at is the current amount of time that you have until retirement. And in this case, really what we can look at is the difference between inflation, which of course erodes your purchasing power, and then salary increases you may have. If you are very pleased with your lifestyle right now, then we can just use inflation as an estimate. And remember, the longer this period of time is until retirement, the bigger impact inflation is going to have, and all the more reason, of course, that we want to continue to use inflation. So I just used an example here where I'm assuming right here 5% growth in salary off this $100,000 salary. Let's say you have 10 years to go till retirement. I think 5% a year is very good if you can manage that. Well, you can see it's a pretty big difference. That $100,000 is now up to $162,000. So you can think of that as salary growth if we're going to continue to spend all of our paycheck, other than, of course, what we're saving, and we're not increasing that percentage, and what we pay in taxes. So one thing that is important to think about, particularly for modeling out salary growth, is, of course, there are changes. The whole point of a marginal tax rate is that there are different tax brackets, and the more money you make, the more taxes you, of course, will pay. And the good thing from a retirement situation around a marginal tax rate is that as those taxes increase, your income replacement rate will actually go down. So it is one benefit. While none of us like to pay higher taxes, it is a benefit of higher taxes when we're thinking about retirement planning. All right, now we need to talk a little bit about lifestyle and lifestyle changes that are going to occur. And what this really involves is obviously thinking about what your life will be like in retirement. So the very simple first thing we can think about is, are we potentially, or are you considering moving to a place that has higher or lower cost of living? So a lot of people do choose to relocate in retirement, and that, of course, can be a factor. So you need to account for those. And it is a little tricky to account for those, of course, because even if your plan is to move to a location where you believe that living expenses are cheaper, it's very hard to figure that out exactly. But think about some of those big expenses that you pay. So whether that's housing, if you haven't paid off your mortgage, things like that, where you can probably come up with a fair estimate just by doing a little bit of research. And this mortgage question is very important because for most people, and especially how things are going now, the biggest portion of a salary will go to living or your place of residence. So whether that's rent, whether that is mortgage payments that you're making, think about sort of your pathway and whether you anticipate actually getting to a point where you no longer have a mortgage when you retire. And there are a lot of benefits, of course, to paying off your mortgage before retirement, even if you are making extra payments. And we'll talk about those a little bit tonight. But really, of course, that is wiping out a very large single expense that a lot of people do face. So something important to change. Will your spending patterns change in retirement? So there are two different ways to think about this. So obviously, going to work, for those people that are still going to work and not working from home, that, of course, costs money. So whether those are expenses that you pay related to commuting, I don't know if this is sort of an antiquated notion now, but certainly expenses you pay related to perhaps the clothing you need to wear to work, maintaining, dry cleaning, et cetera, that clothing, there could be some differences. But another important thing to think about is that in many cases, retirees' spending actually goes up when they retire. So because you don't have to be at work all the time, you have more time, of course, to spend money. So whether that's going out for more meals, whether that's traveling more, really thinking carefully around what those differences will be in your day-to-day spending and your annual spending. And remember that in retirement, in many cases, there are different levels of spending patterns depending upon where you are in retirement. A lot of people spend the most money when they've just retired, when physically, from a health perspective, they're still in really good shape. And then that spending tends to taper down as people become less active, and then it can spike again towards the end of life. But what we're really trying to do is look at that initial spending that you will have as you retire. And then kind of lastly, before we start thinking about our portfolio, before we start thinking about our super account and what size our super account needs to do, we need to think through what are the different sources of retirement income that you may have. So certainly the age pension is a big one. If you believe that you will qualify for the age pension, and obviously look up the different asset test rules around that, see if you're going to qualify. Anything additional that you're getting that does not come from your portfolio, and whatever you kind of consider that sitting in super, if you happen to own an investment property that is generating cash flows, that's sitting outside of super. That's another source of income. Think about all those other sources of income you may have, because we're actually going to remove those from this equation. We're going to do that because, remember, we're sort of just purely looking at our portfolio, because that's sort of the point of this exercise, to figure out how much you need in your super to actually retire. And kind of the last point I would make is also think about your super balances and some of the rules around a pension account, where, as I mentioned, you do not pay taxes on dividends or capital gains or any withdrawals. If you exceed that minimum pension account or the maximum pension account number, then you will have to continue to pay taxes, even if your money isn't super. Now, that will only be a portion of your account value, and also you'll still benefit from the lower taxes in super, but it won't be zero. So something to think about as well as you're working this out. All right, so let's use a simple example. So in this case, we talked about a current salary of $100,000. We looked at taxes, we looked at savings, in this case, only the savings going into super, but if you're saving outside of super, include that as well. And we can see right now, what are our spending needs in retirement? Well, this means if we were to retire today, we would need $70,133 a year. But we are assuming that we retire in 10 years. We're assuming some annual salary growth for those 10 years. So now we're at $103,000. Then we start making lifestyle adjustments. And of course, we make adjustments for anything that we get outside of super. So what does that leave us with? Well, it leaves us with $69,000 in total of annual spending. And when we compare that up to the actual salary, remember the salary is higher because we're looking at pre-tax salary, that $100,000 growing to $162,000 that we had on the previous slide. We're looking at a 56% replacement rate. And it's a good number to remember, especially as we're doing this, because if we are estimating from a time that where you still have a significant amount of time before retirement, we can think about that replacement rate in terms of salary growth and seeing how that's actually going to change. All right, I think we have a couple questions. Let me just see. Yep. So we'll do that before we get into withdrawal rate. Oh, thank you for, let's see. Wow, we have lots of questions. So Bernard says early data point and income replacement rate, early retirement 54. So yes, you have sort of fired. So that's financial independence, retire early, and I'm still working a little bit, about 20%. I think my income replacement rate is tracking at around 33% from an admittedly high income that allowed me to save quite a bit after tax. Yeah, so once again, the more you save while you're working, also the lower that income replacement rate will be. And Daniel likes the pay calculator site. And saying, what's everyone putting in for inflation at the moment? Yeah, listen, it benefits you to be conservative. So I think kind of anyone out there, Daniel, is hoping that inflation is not 4% for a extended period of time, but it doesn't hurt to be conservative, because at the end of the day, what happens? Well, you just have a nicer retirement. Yeah, of course, it's okay to share links. So Andrew says, I'm 55 on 115 grand per year and still a mortgage, happy to have a lower salary and mortgages out of the way. Yeah, exactly. Because remember, if you can pay off your mortgage, that is a huge benefit to you financially, because of course that is after tax money that you were spending on your mortgage, and just substantially increases your cash flow. Paul says, I spent a lot less since COVID. Well, that's good. My spending seems to have rebounded significantly since COVID. So maybe I need some tricks for you. What do you do if your pension minimum is greater than your expenditure? So the pension. So I assume you're saying if you are eligible for the pension, perhaps So maybe if you could just clarify what that means, that would be helpful. And yeah, Paul should go on holiday because that is a good way to spend a lot of money. What's the best site for seeing what state super you're entitled to based on savings, private pension, Australia and the UK? That's a good question. I don't have a great answer for anything UK related. But maybe if someone else. Oh, Daniel wants longer sessions. You might be in the minority there. I know Emily doesn't think that. But yeah, we can keep going at the end if we still have more questions. Let's see. Well, I think these are mostly comments, so I'll just keep moving, but send anything through, send anything else through, and I will spend some more time on those. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about a withdrawal rate. And I'll go kind of high level, but I have all sorts of material on withdrawal rates if you guys would like to see it. But really the biggest challenge we have, as I said, is we are now trying to convert, when we move into retirement, a lump sum of money. And we're trying to take that lump sum and figure out how much we can take out every year, with the challenge that we don't know how long retirement will last. And there's really two risks that we face when we are retiring. The first one is sequencing risk. And sequencing risk basically means that not only does the average return, because remember, your money is still invested during retirement, not only does the average return that we earn over our retirement lifetime matter, but the order of those returns matter as well. And we do have a slide that demonstrates this in a second that can illustrate what this challenge is. And then, of course, longevity risk is, hey, it's great to live for a long time, but not so great when you're trying to live off of this lump sum of money that's in your super. And so longevity risk is, of course, that we know when the average person dies, at what age the average person dies, but if you live significantly longer, it could be a problem. So we're trying to come up with a withdrawal rate that takes into account both of these risks. So the risk that you can live for a very long time and the risk that you retire at the wrong time, that basically you are unlucky enough to retire in a really poor return environment that's going to impact how long that portfolio can last for. So sequencing risk, and I do think that this is a good little way of explaining it. And so, as I said, the order and timing of your returns really matters. So I'm looking at two scenarios. So both scenarios last for 20 years. It's a $500,000 portfolio. I've used the S&P 500, and I'll tell you why in a second. And you're taking out $20,000 a year. So $20,000 a year corresponds with that 4% withdrawal rate, which we'll talk about in a second, which is one of the famous rules of retirement planning. So we can look at return A, or scenario A. So after 20 years, between the year 2000 and 2020, you have $165,000 left. Okay. And at this stage, given the lifespan that many people are experiencing, 20 years potentially does not encompass your entire retirement, right? So many people can live significantly longer than that. And then we have scenario B, where all I did was took the exact same return. So mathematically, you would achieve the same average return over those 20-year periods. But all I did is I flipped them. So basically, the return we get in 2020 goes back to 2001, et cetera. So all I did was flip the order of those returns, and you have $782,000 left. So this is why sequencing risk matters. And the risk is that if you retire into a low returning environment, very poor return environment, of course, if the market goes back up, which it has historically, you have less money because you're actually pulling money out of your account while this happens. Now, I picked a very specific time frame because if you go back and you think about that first decade in the 2000s, it was a very challenging decade for investors. So kind of right off the bat was the dot-com market crash, which really impacted the S&P 500. Then a little bit later on in that decade, we had the global financial crisis, also very negative for investors. And actually over that first 10-year period, we had negative returns on the S&P 500. over a decade. So not a great environment to retire into, but simply flipping those returns and moving those poor returns into the second decade of the 2000s had a profound effect on the amount of money we ultimately have at the end of that period, even though that average return is the same. So it just shows the impact of poor returns and retiring into a poor return environment, which of course you have no idea if you're going to do that or not, because none of us know what's going to happen in the future. So that's sequencing risk. That's the first concern we have. The second, of course, issue that we have is looking at how long we're actually going to live. So basically what I did is took a 65-year-old male. I did not do this. I got this from Australian Life Tables. 65-year-old male, and the percent chance, the probability of you dying in each year. So what we can see is kind of the average when somebody died, but you can still see there's a lot of people that, of course, live beyond that. And that's really what we're worried about in terms of longevity risk and the challenge we have of trying to figure out how much we take out of our portfolio every year. So those two things really, and if you look at both of those things and you look at what we would do to battle those two risks. If we look at longevity risk, right, as we said, that we know when the average person dies, we don't know when any single person will die. And what would you do to mitigate that? Well, if you have a very long time period you need to invest in, we want to invest in a lot of growth assets because we want to have some growth assets like shares, because we want to have the highest return possible over that time period, because we could live for a very long time and we want to account for that. But then if we go and we look at sequencing risk, what we're really trying to stop is we're trying to stop our portfolio dropping significantly in value right as we retire and start to withdraw money from it. So how would we combat that? Well, so we would want a less volatile portfolio. We would want to hold more in defensive assets like cash and fixed interest, because that in most cases means your portfolio will not drop as much. So as you're probably figuring out, these two things are actually in conflict. And this is the challenge, right? We want to hold a lot of growth assets, as many growth assets as possible to deal with longevity risk, but we don't want our portfolio to drop too much in value. And the volatility of growth assets is higher, meaning they bounce around more in price. And in any given year, they could fall significantly more. So if we want to stop our portfolio from falling a lot, we want less of those growth assets. So these two things are in conflict. And that's a real challenge we face when trying to plan our retirement. So the 4% rule, and I'll go through this quickly because I do talk about it a lot, but once again, I have a lot of information. But this is the challenge that financial advisors continually faced with clients. And one of them, this guy by the name of Bill Bengen, said, okay, what I'm going to do is I'm going to go back and I'm going to look at data and try to figure out what is a safe withdrawal rate, sort of a rule of thumb that we can use for retirees. So he did this in the early 90s. Now, a couple of things that are important to note here is, number one, he looked at a portfolio of 50% shares and 50% bonds. And that might seem crazy right now. But remember, interest rates were still significantly higher in the early 90s, which means you got a lot better returns from bonds. They were certainly more attractive. Lifespans were lower back then. So people weren't as aggressive with their asset allocation. But he took this portfolio and he ran it through every historical return combination. He went back from 1926 to 1992. Now, he only looked at US markets. So US shares and US bonds. That's one thing. And he tried to come up with, what is this safe withdrawal rate under all these scenarios? If you have the bad luck to retire into a terrible market, basically the combination of the worst market for shares and bonds between 1926 and 1992, and sort of that sequence of those returns, what is that withdrawal rate that would give you a high probability of being able to not run out of money for 30 years? And that's what he defined retirement as. And one really important thing is that he used a consistent real withdrawal rate. So that's the way the 4% rule works. So when we're looking at inflation, when we're looking at inflation in terms of estimating our retirement, we're only looking at the period with which we are still working. We're not looking at it at retirement because the safe withdrawal rate accounts for inflation. So basically that 4% is only used in your first year of retirement. So if you have a $100,000 portfolio, you're going to take out $4,000 a year. And then you were going to adjust that dollar figure by inflation every year after that. So if we had, just so I can do the math easily, we had 10% inflation, we take out $4,000 the first year, we would take $4,400 out that next year. So remember, this does account for inflation. And so he ran this whole scenario using these historic returns. He came up with this 4% rule. And that 4% rule, of course, is very famous in retirement planning now. The question is, does this 4% rule apply to, number one, to you? And does it still apply in general? So I need to update this slide, this last point on the slide, but basically bond yields are still very low. So I did do this before we had the increase in interest rates, but bond yields are still historically fairly low. We're getting back kind of to average, but remember, lower bond yields equal lower future returns. So that interest rate on the bonds is going to impact your returns. Share valuations have come down a little bit. They're about average now, but remember, higher valuations equal lower future returns. And these are all things that we want to take into account when we're looking at that. Inflation has changed since I put this together. But remember, low inflation means that you can have a higher withdrawal rate because those increases in the dollar amount that you're taking out every single year do change. So we did update this state of retirement report. So sorry, I did not update this. It's now 3.8%. Based on what happened in 2021. We'll come up with another estimate probably in the next month or two with a new number based on market returns since then and that kind of economic environment. But really what Morningstar was trying to do was look forward and look at what we expect returns to be in the future versus just looking at this historic period between 1926 and 1992. So if anyone wants the latest copy of that state of retirement report, let me know, send me an email and I will get that to you. But really it goes through and is very in depth. It goes through all the different considerations in here. So let's quickly do the math and I can answer some questions and then go back and talk about some other things we'll think about. So let's assume that we want to use a 4% withdrawal rate and just show mathematically what that means. All right, so if you need $40,000 a year at a 4% withdrawal rate, as you're estimating how much you need for retirement, that's $1 million. All right, so pretty simple. You can reverse engineer that, $1 million, and all you do is divide that. So just divide $40,000 divided by 0.04, it will be $1 million, and sort of reverse engineering that, $1 million times 4% equals $40,000 a year. But if you are to use a lower withdrawal rate, you can see that that, of course, increases significantly, in this case, the amount of money you need for retirement. So that withdrawal rate does matter. And really one big consideration for anyone when looking at a withdrawal rate is thinking about, and especially with inflation, thinking about your own personal inflation. Are you going to increase the amount of money you take out by the official inflation rate? Could you potentially be more flexible about that withdrawal strategy, not increasing it as much as inflation? And what are the different things you can think about there? Now, one obvious thing that we talked about is a mortgage. So if you go back and you look at the inflation numbers in Australia, for example, and I'd say around the world, but if you go and look at Australia, obviously housing makes up a very large part of that basket of goods that makes up CPI, where we determine inflation. And there has been a lot of inflation around housing costs. So number one, obviously property prices continue to increase, but also we have higher interest rates, which increases the amount that people pay for mortgages. If you're not a renter and you read the paper, well, rents have increased significantly as well. So a lot of that goes away in your own personal situation if you have paid off your mortgage. So you do need to think about this sort of personally and think about, out of the amount of money that you are withdrawing from your retirement, how much of that is for absolute necessities and how much can you actually be a little flexible on, right? So is this example of $40,000 a year, if $38,000 of the year of that is absolute necessities that you need, basically shelter and food and medical expenses, well, you don't have much flexibility, right? If you are only spending $20,000 a year on those absolute necessities and you're spending $20,000 a year traveling, well, you can obviously cut back on that traveling. You have more flexibility built into your budget. So it's really important that everyone looks at their personal circumstances and how close to those bare minimums is the amount that your portfolio is supporting you in taking out. So that is a really important consideration as you're thinking through what your approach is. And there are multiple different withdrawal strategies that you can think about. I won't go into all of them, but most of these hopefully make sense. So, well, I'll go through them very quickly. Foregoing inflation adjustment simply means that you're going to take the same amount. Maybe you would do that if you have your house paid off, for example, and you are, have a fair gap between your absolute necessities and what you're spending. So that means we just won't take out inflation adjustment. That can increase that withdrawal rate. Required minimum distributions. So basically all three of these, I guess, required minimum distributions, guardrails method, and the 10% reduction following losses means that we are not increasing our portfolio. We're not increasing our withdrawals by inflation. We're looking at how our portfolio performs and letting that govern how much we take out. So in years where your portfolio performed very poorly, you would potentially reduce the amount of money you were taking out to make sure that you are not suffering as much from sequencing risk. And all three of these methods are just different approaches to do that. So 10% reductions following losses means your portfolio goes down. You're actually reducing the dollar amount that you take out by 10%. Guardrails is a similar method, which is basically means that if your portfolio goes up significantly, you're not taking all of that out, all of those additional gains, and same thing on the downside. So you do have these guardrails around what you're withdrawing based on portfolio movements. So all different flexible withdrawal strategies that you can use. And what you'll find, and this is a chart from this report, this retirement report, is that depending upon, and I'm not great with colors, but you see here that taking one of these flexible withdrawal strategies can actually change the amount that is safe to take out of your account, depending upon which one you actually pick. And so if people want that report, it goes through all of this in detail. One other point I wanted to make around withdrawal rates is the question I always get on all of these is there are, of course, mandated withdrawals depending upon your age in super. The other thing I'd say about this, and they're not 4%, and they actually change over time. As you get older, those required withdrawals actually increase. And this is, of course, because the government's trying to get money out of super and make sure that you are actually spending that money and you're not just using the tax advantages in super to build up this huge portfolio that can then be passed on to your heirs. So remember that is a very specific government policy trying to solve a specific problem that the government sees. It's not really looking out for your best interests. And just because you take something out of super does not mean you have to spend it. So you can, of course, just take the money out of super and put it into an investment or a bank account or anything else outside of super. What we're really talking about when we're talking about withdrawal rates, is we're talking about your spending. How much are you going to spend? So just remember that there's a difference between those two. All right, so how do we bring this all together? And then I'll get to questions. So one, obviously remember income replacement rate. Let's first estimate how much we need to replace of our income. That can give us that baseline of how much we think we're going to spend. Make inflation adjustments if you have a while to go before you actually retire. So we're looking at inflation adjustments, and we're looking at, of course, wage increases and sort of lifestyle increases you think will occur before retirement. We need to take both of those into account. Figure out a safe withdrawal rate. And there's no reason you need to pick one. If you have a while to go before retirement, you can look at a range, right? You could have a more conservative amount that is lower that would result in a larger portfolio value. And then we can have a withdrawal rate that's a little higher, and that can give you a range, especially if you have a while to go before retirement. I need between $500,000 and $700,000. And we can refine that as we go along. And we have a better idea of the inflation environment, but also our own spending needs as we get closer to retirement. And then simply to get that lump sum, as I said, all you need to do is take the amount that you need to come out of your portfolio and divide it by that withdrawal rate. And if we're using two different withdrawal rates to try to create that range, we can, of course, divide by both, and that can give you the range that your portfolio needs to support. All right, so let's go. We seem to have a lot in the chat. Okay, so Lisa has a good question. So she says, how do we work out a safe withdrawal rate that won't mean we need to sell down equities? Okay, so it's a really good question. There is a theory out there, which I'll walk through, which I certainly agree with, but with some caveats. And there is a theory, of course, that you never sell off your principal, which means, and you just live off of your income. So very simply, the theory is that, okay, if I'm just living off of my income and I'm not selling the things actually in my portfolio, the things that are generating that income, then of course I will always be fine. I will always be fine because those assets are not getting sold that generate the income. And I don't have to worry about longevity risk. And I don't really have to worry about sequencing risk either, because I'm not selling off these positions when they fall significantly. So can you do this? Yes, of course you can do this, but there are a couple of things to keep in mind. The first thing is dividends, of course, get cut. They get cut, they get eliminated. Things can happen. So your income isn't necessarily stable. So what you would have to do to make this work in a pure sense is you would have to make sure that you were adjusting your lifestyle by changes in income. So what that would mean is, and you can build cash buffers and things around that, but what it would mean in a year like 2020, when many, many companies cut their dividends, what it would mean is you would have had to significantly pull back on your withdrawals from your portfolio and basically your lifestyle. Now, in 2020, that probably worked because there was nothing to do and you couldn't leave your house. But think about those scenarios and what would happen if we had a COVID-like market business disruption where you were still out there spending money. The other thing that, of course, you have to worry about is inflation. And will your dividends and the income from your portfolio keep up with inflation? So dividends historically have done better against inflation, of course, because these are companies that can raise prices, even though that is a challenging environment for companies to operate in. Bonds don't do as well either. And if you are invested more in bonds, you have to think about the reinvestment risk that occurs in a falling interest rate environment. And very simply, what that means is if I go out there and buy a 10-year bond and that bond's yielding 5%, I'm happy, right? So I'm collecting my 5% a year in interest. I'm taking it out of my account. I'm not touching that bond principal. I know I'll get $10,000 back in 10 years as long as the bond is safe. Well, what happens when that bond matures and now 10-year bonds are at 2%? Well, that's reinvestment risk. So that can be a challenge for you as well. So while in theory, this just live off your income works, think about these different scenarios and think about how that's going to influence the portfolio you purchase. So remember, a lot of people, when they're going for income, of course, the natural approach to that is I'll just find the highest yielding shares and the highest yielding bonds. And that's great. But those are also, at least on the dividend side of things, those are companies that are more likely to cut their dividends because they're probably paying out a lot of their earnings with dividends. So that's one problem you face. And also because they're paying out so much of their earnings in dividends, they might not be able to grow that dividend as fast. So just remember, that's the challenge you're facing, trying to set your portfolio up to support that challenge. And one way you can do that is building in a cash buffer. And of course, that cash buffer can get you through periods where income is actually falling. You've got some cash to dip into. So cash can be really valuable when you're doing that. All right. Well, apparently we have lots in the chat. Hopefully this is mostly people chatting to themselves. Wow. Let's see, where were we? Roddy says, don't retire just before a bear market. Yeah, no, that's also great advice. Lisa can't live to 100. Well, somebody has to take care of the alpacas, Lisa. And Daniel is committed to his 80-20 portfolio, and he's going to get a bumper sticker, which is good. So, sorry, I'm looking. Oh, Bernard says 80-20 is not good enough. 90-10. So different bumper stickers. So maybe somebody can support their retirement by making these bumper stickers with just your asset allocation on the back of your car. And John's living to 187. Must be healthier than me. Yep, I agree with you, Lisa. So bonds do reduce a diversified portfolio's returns, but they also provide stability. That is true. Sorry, I'm just trying to read through all the comments. Yeah, so for Mark, if you could send me an email, just at mark.lamonica1@morningstar.com, I can get you that report. Okay, so John says, what if your income varies significantly? Yes, it is more difficult, of course, to do this if you do have variable income. But really what I would look at then is you can just look at your after-tax spending. So I think most people don't actually have a budget. Maybe I'm just mostly focused on myself here, but if you are very aware of what your spending is, even with a variable income, then you can use that spending because that will be after tax. So really what I do is spend some time looking at a budget, unless your spending also varies significantly based on your income. Oh. Little John the alpaca is unwell. He overate some pine needles. Well, that happens to all of us, overindulging in things. So I think most of those weren't questions, which is good. But anyway, just to summarize, once again, there is a value, no matter how old you are, in spending some time thinking about your retirement needs, and that can guide the approach that you're actually taking with your portfolio. So spend some time going through this. Honestly, all it takes is a couple minutes to actually do the calculation, and then some more time to think about the different approaches you may take during retirement and those different spending needs that you may have. So it is valuable to go through this exercise. And at the very least, you can use this as a benchmark as your salary increases or potentially decreases in how this is going to impact your retirement plan. And understanding that number you're trying to get to, even if it's a range, your retirement number, how big your portfolio needs to be, then it can start informing the different decisions you make. So whether that's your savings rate into retirement, whether you want to make extra contributions in the super over the compulsory amount, whether you need to make some decisions about potentially cutting back on your retirement expectations, and frankly, the type of returns that you're trying to chase with your portfolio. Those are all really valuable pieces of information for investors. So I would recommend you spend a little bit of time going through this. It won't take that long. Most of it will be thinking, and hopefully we'll be thinking good thoughts about the great retirement that you're going to have. But understanding those different levers that will go into how big your portfolio gets, and then the different levers that will affect retirement is important. So Paul says a more general investment is the US in a bull market. The ASX seems to be all over the place, hence ETF choice. Okay, so the US is officially back in a bull market. So what that means is the market has gone up. The S&P 500 has gone up by 20% since it went down by 20% last year, 20% and more. So officially it's a bull market. I think a lot of people, if I can put my 2 cents in, a lot of people don't feel like it's a bull market. A lot of it has been driven by what everyone is now calling the Magnificent Seven. So basically 7 tech stocks that have really driven the market higher. So I think for a lot of people, it doesn't feel like a bull market, but the US is officially in a bull market. What I'd say about the ASX is it had a decent year. Just remember the ASX also did not fall as much as the US. So the ASX never went into a bear market. So while the returns have been significantly better this year in the US, they were a lot worse last year. So it just adds a little perspective to this. But anyway, thank you guys for joining. I'll be back at 6 if anyone wants to talk about housing. Anyway, send any questions or requests for that report to mark.lamonica1@morningstar.com. And sorry about the technical difficulties. I'll blame it on Emily, since she doesn't talk during these things. She's looking at me skeptically. But anyway, thank you guys very much.
This video has been prepared for clients of Morningstar Australasia Proprietary Limited and or New Zealand wholesale clients of Morningstar Research Limited. Any general advice has been provided without reference to your financial objectives, situation, or needs. You should consider the advice in light of these matters and any relevant product disclosure statement before making any decision to invest. To obtain advice for your own situation, contact a financial advisor.